Well, Katty Kay is in our Washington, D.C. bureau. The worst mass shooting in U.S. history. What has been the reaction where you are, Katty?
Well, an overwhelming reaction from politicians, from the American public, and from people in Florida, Alpa, who are queuing up in hospitals to give blood. Apparently, the blood banks are overwhelmed with the level of support that local people are turning out to try and give blood, because you have to remember there are still 53 people who are injured in hospitals. They need treating. The priority today is looking after those who are still injured, trying to get them the attention and the help that they need, looking after the families of the victims, and looking after this investigation. The investigation now taking place at a federal level. The FBI is involved. President Obama is going to speak to the American people in half an hour's time, and he will address the issue of the investigation and, of course, what the White House's response is. I've been in contact this morning with a senior counterterrorism official at the White House. They say it's very important from their point of view that the president's words speak to what the White House is doing in terms of this investigation, trying to reassure the American public on issues of safety, but also, of course, empathize with the degree of fear that there is in this country around the issue of terrorism and national security. So we will hear from the president. I think that's the only White House official that we will be hearing from today. But they have to explain to the American public what happened here as far as they know, given that this is a very new investigation, and what the White House is trying to do to make the country safer in the light of this. Let me bring in Daveed Gartenstein-Ross. He's a counterterrorism expert with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. He's also here in the Washington Bureau with me. Daveed, it's very early in this investigation, and we should make that absolutely clear. But what's your understanding about what we know so far about this attack?
Well, the shooter has been identified, of course, as Omar Mateen. In one of the early press conferences around 7 a.m. this morning, you had an FBI official say that early leads suggest that he was motivated by jihadist ideology, but they also caveated that by making sure that people understood it was very early in the process. You have a profile of him start to emerge, though one should always be cautious, because there's a fog of war effect this early, close to violent incidents. For example, there are several different people in the country named Omar Mateen. As far as I know, you don't have an official picture that's been released yet, and so I'd be cautious of people having some sort of mistaken identities in the process, and in that way, bad information gumming up the works.
And actually, we have had one photograph that's been released. I think that's been put on air, Daveed, just a few minutes ago. You're an expert in counterterrorism. You've been involved in this kind of an investigation. What are officials looking for in these early hours? What are the critical things in these first few hours after an attack that they're going to try to be understanding?
Yeah, the photograph, by the way, is from his MySpace page, and I could point you, after this segment's done, to several other photographs that are there. The one thing I'd caution is that in looking at the MySpace page, there's nothing that identifies him with Florida, so I still have a little bit of a question as to whether people are jumping to conclusions about who it is. That being said, everybody is reaching that same conclusion. In terms of what authorities are going to be doing, they're going to be looking for his electronic trail. One of the highest priorities is, does he have other associates who, if the terrorism lead ends up being the truest one, are there other associates who could also pose a danger to the community? How deeply does this go? Who knew? Where did he get his weapons from? Those will be the kind of questions that they're pursuing, both in terms of honing in on a motive, but more to the point, trying to protect the public from anything else that could pose an immediate danger to them.
Okay, Daveed, stay with us. We're going to hear now from Rajini Vaidyanathan. She's down there in Florida, outside where this attack took place. Rajini, what's the scene down there at the moment?
Well, Katty, I've just arrived here a few minutes ago, but as you can probably see, if I just move the camera down a bit, there is a police cordon here, lots of media as well, and it's about 2 or 3 blocks from where I'm actually standing that the nightclub is at. And as you've probably been reporting through your coverage, but it is clear from being on the ground here that there is a state of emergency here, and of course a police investigation which continues. Many of the victims are still unidentified, so local agencies here are urging people to call their hotlines and get in touch with them. And as you can probably hear, above me are a number of police helicopters here. So understandably, a very huge police presence here in a city that now has a state of emergency.
Regini, there have been calls for people to give blood. What's the response been down there to that? And what do we know, if anything, about the status of the people who are injured and in hospital?
Well, on the local radio station, as I was travelling here in a taxi, I heard people talking about the blood donations. I heard people saying that there are very long queues. I haven't witnessed them myself as yet, but long queues, people donating blood at nearby blood banks. And I have to confirm this, but I heard as well on the local radio, Kathy, that they have lifted a ban on gay people donating blood, which from what they were saying on the local radio here had been in place, and that has now been lifted. So anyone can give blood here in Orlando. And of course, as you have been talking about in your coverage, as well as the 50 who have lost their lives in this attack, there are more than 50 who are injured, many in a critical condition. Now, we are expecting another update from the FBI and from the local hospitals in about an hour or so after the president has spoken. So we will hopefully get a more clearer idea about how those people who are being treated in hospital are getting on.
Right, we understand that the White House also contacted hospital officials to allow them to lift restrictions on hospitals contacting family members that the United States has in place as well. Regini, give me just some sense of the context of where you are. Orlando, a lot of people from around the world who are watching this program will know it, of course, associated with amusement parks. They may even have been on holiday there. Give me some sort of feel for where you are and the kind of neighborhood that this club is in.
Yes, well, this is Orlando. Of course, as you say, Kathy, a place that many families visit to travel to Disney and other attractions here like Universal Studios. It is a family-focused place, somewhere that you wouldn't expect something like this to happen. But of course, we say that every time these things happen because this is such a tragedy of huge proportions, the worst mass shooting to happen in the United States. But, you know, just to give you an idea, normally on the flights to Orlando, if we travel to Orlando for work, you will see lots of families. This is seen as a very safe and, as I say, family-friendly area, very popular with people from around the world, including, of course, from places like the UK. So it is a part of America that many people from outside do actually know of and have heard of.
Regini, what's the security situation there at the moment? You mentioned that there's a police cordon. Were you, as you flew into Orlando, was there a stepped-up police presence? Does there seem to be extra security on the streets of the city?
I wonder if I could just, if I may, I'm just holding my phone, but if I may switch this round, if it's possible to do so, Catty. There you go. I will just give you a quick tour of what we can see. Yeah. So that's the end of the road there from which I approached. 2 police officers, 2 sheriffs there, not letting anyone down. And then, of course, a large number of the media and police tape. More media just around here, Catty. But if you look further down this road, there are a number of cars, and I was told by the police sheriffs who I was talking to, that's the governor, by the way, Governor Scott, who was just leaving in a car. He's been talking to the media here. He's just speeding off in his car. But there are lots of people, investigators, I would imagine FBI agents and police officers as well, who are the owners of those cars which are further down. And just from where you're looking at this image now, it's about 2 blocks on the left, I was told, that is where the nightclub is. So the cordon actually does run quite far back. I've covered a number of these kinds of shootings, and they always do make us stand very far back, of course, because this is an active police investigation. So it's difficult to really know what is going on, but it's clear from the scale of this and from how far we've been made to actually stand back that this is a huge police operation. And when the police delivered their press conference earlier, they certainly said that they had help from forces across the United States. And I can imagine now, of course, given that there is the possibility that this is a terror attack and they are investigating that as a possible line of inquiry, that as well as that, there will be an international dimension to the investigation. As I said to you just then, though, we are expecting to hear from the FBI in the next hour or so. And I'll just show you here, there is actually a lectern here, Cathy, which is where the police press conference will take place. It says courage, pride and commitment for Orlando. So this is where the police press conferences will take place. And just to remind viewers who might just be joining us, I'm at the scene a few streets away from where America's deadliest mass shooting took place yesterday, just after 2 a.m. And 50 people have been confirmed dead. More than 50 also injured in this attack, and there are also about 30 people, we understand, who were actually rescued after what police described as a hostage-type incident. More people walking towards the scene there, but we are still behind this police cordon, waiting, of course, to get more information from the police. I'll just move that back round so we can share that with our viewers. But they did say earlier, police said that they have now secured the nightclub, so they don't believe that there are any devices or explosives in the nightclub. And as far as they are aware, there is no imminent threat of another attack. But of course, America is on a state of vigilance. I understand as high as it was after 9/11. So, but that is something that, you know, is already in place. No sense of an imminent threat here in Orlando after yesterday's horrific attack.
Okay, Regina Vaidyanathan, for the moment, thank you very much, Regina. And as Regina was saying there, we are bringing you special coverage of the attack in Orlando overnight in a nightclub. 50 people were killed, 53, we understand, are in hospital. Officials are appealing for blood donations to treat those who are still in hospital. The governor of Florida, Rick Scott, has said that this is clearly an act of terror. They are treating it as such. Senator Ben Nelson of Florida has said that he understands from law enforcement officials that the shooter, who has been named as Omar Mateen, had sympathies with Islamic State. That is what we know at the moment on this investigation. President Obama will speak to the public in about 15 minutes' time, and we will get more of the White House's reaction. You can see there a photograph of the alleged shooter, Omar Mateen, which has been taken from social media. Let me bring back in Daveed Gartenstein-Ross, counterterrorism expert. Daveed, in terms of the investigation, you were laying out what the steps and the processes are. There's been quite a lot already discussion this morning about the difference between whether he was the shooter, and again, I should stress that this is the alleged shooter. The details are still just coming into us. The investigation is in its very early stages, so we don't know much about this case. But explain to us the difference between whether an attack in this instance, the shooter had sympathies with Islamic extremist organizations or somehow was linked to and directed by Islamic extremist organizations. What's the critical difference there in terms of national security and counterterrorism?
The critical difference is that if he had sympathies with, that means he was inspired by them. He didn't necessarily have connections with the organization, wasn't necessarily directed, whereas something where it's linked to or directed by is much stronger. If it was linked to, that means that there was some degree of connection to the organization. It could have been an electronic connection. It might be a physical connection, either in local networks or perhaps overseas travel. That's happened in some cases, not necessarily in this one. And then directed by is even one step stronger. It's that the organization had foreknowledge and either gave its authorization or else instructed him to attack that specific target. So earlier this year we saw, or last year rather, we saw an attack against a Draw Muhammad cartoon contest in Garland, Texas. That had fairly strong linkages to the ISIS network. There was foreknowledge within the network. That's fairly clear by all of the information that has come out about the Garland attack. In this particular case, what they're looking for is what's that degree of connection. And if he was part of, say, a local logistics type network or something of the sort, you can bet that authorities are going to try to hone in and learn everything they can about the network. One final thing I want to mention is that in the past, when you look at terrorism cases, there's been a strong bias in favor of actually not finding a network connection. The New York Times had a very good piece on that this year, where Rukmini Callimachi was looking at European attacks that have occurred over the years and found that going back to 2012, you've had a number of attacks with a much stronger connection to the ISIS network than was originally seen. So that's worth bearing in mind as you look at the lone wolf versus organized network terrorism argument that may play out.
Two questions, Daveed. What can you surmise from the amount of ammunition that this shooter had? 50 people killed, 53 more injured, and from reports from his father that he had a hatred of the LGBT community.
His father's discussion is very, very telling. His father talked about two men kissing in a restaurant and went into a rage saying, look, they're doing this in front of my kids. And then his father mentioned something about being in the bathroom and seeing men kissing in the bathroom. Basically, it's very clear that Omar Mateen had seen LGBT-type activity around his family and was enraged by that. That's something that's going to go to his overall motive. In terms of the amount of ammunition, ammunition isn't that hard to get. When you're looking at a weapon of this kind, the thing that takes the most skill isn't so much shooting it. That's not a very difficult thing, but the reload in between clips. But in this packed space, and given the kind of weapon he had, he may have had time. So we don't know the amount of skill, and we don't know that the ammunition should have given people a heads up that something like this was happening. For someone, for example, who goes to a shooting range, it's not uncommon to stock an enormous amount of ammunition just for your own practice shooting.
Okay, Daveed Gartenstein-Ross, thanks very much for joining us, Daveed. And I should say that Senator Bob Casey has already just called for the banning of the type of weapon that was used in this attack. We will hear more from President Obama. He will be addressing the nation in about 10 minutes' time. We'll, of course, bring you full coverage of that. For the moment, that's it here in Washington. Alpa, back to you in the studio in London.